буквально трішечки її залишилося.
Ну, і ми по ходу вже посадимо. Ви посувайтеся сюди, мабуть, ближче до мене, щоб у нас тут не було порожніх місць. Ми з краю залишимо. Це 12 квітня, працюємо.
Today is April 12, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform starts its operation today. My name is Vasil Samakhvalov and we will be talking about the project. We will have the presentation of the interactive map of places where Russians are holding Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. So first guest today, well basically our last guest that we've been waiting for, is Tetyana Katrychenko, coordinator of the Media Initiative for Human Rights. Joining us as well are Anastasia Panteleeva, head of the documentation at the Media Initiative for Human Rights, Kateryna Ogievska, civilians in captivity NGO representative, Alla Zhuhan, she's the wife of a civil hostage from Sumy region. And in this studio we have her husband Oleksandr, who was imprisoned by Russians. We wanted to invite him first as a speaker, but then we decided due to the moral circumstances not to ask him. We will see whether Mr. Oleksandr will want to join us here as the speaker later. So I'm having this question to our guests. Please tell us about your project. What are the tasks being solved by it? How to use it properly? When can we get familiarized? And where can we get familiarized with that? Well, good afternoon. Thank you for gathering here. It's an important topic. It was a lengthy project. We, in cooperation with the 5 AM coalition, we work on this project from the very first day of the full-scale invasion. As a media initiative, we work with it starting from 2017. Now in this screen you may see an interactive map. It looks like a map with the pins, but in fact there was a great job done here. And first of all, this map shows the places of detention of civilians and military in the occupied territories. They were imprisoned during different periods. Some of the territories were already liberated from the 24th of February. It includes the territory of occupied Crimea, and there is also a great section of Russian Federation covered with those pins. Those are the results of our research, of our studies. We have a printed version, so yeah, it's right there in the hall. There is a QR code, and using this QR code you can check out this map. There is also a reference from our website. There is a reference to this interactive map. It will be permanently updated. First of all, because we try to the best of our capabilities to counter it, but day by day the number of people being detained, both military and civilians, it keeps growing. It's clear that there are exchanges going on. The civilians and military, the servicemen, they are coming back home, but still, nevertheless, there is a large part of territory still being occupied, and on a daily basis the people are being detained on those territories. And it happens every day that we identify the new places of detention. we cannot say is the comprehensive picture of all the places of detention, but what's important for us is that we were talking to the hostages, to the witnesses that were kept there in all those places. So in fact we were unable to cover all the witnesses clearly to represent clearly a bigger map. It may include more than 100 places of detention maybe, but we will keep working to document every single place of such detention so that those responsible for organization of such detention and those responsible for relocation of both servicemen and the civilians and detention of those people in those atrocious conditions, so that those responsible are being brought to liability and punished for the war crimes they are committing. So talking about the job we've done, the work was going on for more than 1 year. We keep questioning people who were freed from the imprisonment. We don't only question those whom we pulled officially from imprisonment, but we keep communicating with the military and the civilians. A large part of those questionings is going on because, well, I hope the people, they trust us, and we do this work in a non-public manner. Sometimes we cannot disclose all the information, sometimes we cannot disclose even their names, but we understand that at certain moment that information will become of use to us, because sometimes the international organizations or our law enforcement agencies, who work very diligently on this matter. Sometimes they may not have some piece of this puzzle, but we may have it, so everything is properly documented. We try in coalition. There is such an agreement that we work with the database called IDOC. It's the database which contains all the witnesses, all the evidences with information consents of the victims of such crimes or their relatives, and this is how we can find connections, how we can find those responsible for those crimes. Our law enforcement agencies and law enforcement agencies of other countries were using those those data from the database during the conflicts in Syria, in Chechnya. We understand how important it is now to gather, to collect as much information as possible, because our organization and me personally, I work on questioning of servicemen and civilians for a number of years. I was communicating with those who were liberated way before the full-scale invasion in 2017, 2019. I see how the time deletes some memories. I understand that those are difficult tribulations, something that people want to forget and just throw that piece of their lives away from their memory. And it's important when we meet such people who were witnesses to those events, we ask what are the punishments, what is the liability that those who did it to you should brought to. Some people, they just say, I want to forget it, I don't want to remember anything, and some keep saying that yes, we want those guilty to be brought to liability in a proper way. We want them to be punished, and not only Russian Federation as the aggressor country, but every single person, every single one who was committing those crimes, they want them to be punished. We understand that the number of crimes is immense. According to the information from the Prosecutor General's office, it's more than 70,000 crimes now, so it's a great piece of work for the law enforcement agencies, but for the human rights organizations as well, just like ours organization. We got united into 5 a.m. coalition that very day of the beginning of the full-scale invasion to properly document all those crimes, not to do any parallel work, not to dub each other, and just work as a single mechanism. I think that my colleagues will tell you more about the specific places of detention, because there is a researcher for southern regions. She knows more about Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, the Crimea, how the people are getting transported to Russian Federation. Anastasia, Kateryna, they may tell you about what's going on with the civilians, because the civilians understood as well that it's difficult to act all alone on their own. So they got organized into a civil organization. So there is also a wife of a former civil prisoner present here. She may tell you about the tribulations, about the complications that they experienced during this process. But what I want to highlight is that in those more than 100 places of detention, there are more than 1,000 people kept there. And those thousands of people, well, I'm talking about maybe 10,000 people, maybe even closer to 15,000, but those are the specific lives, those are the very concrete destinies, and we have to seek justice behind all this story. Okay, Miss Anastasia, may you give us more concrete details? How many people were already questioned? What is the way that the creation of this database is going on? Who works with that database, and why do those people work with that database? Well, we document it. First of all, we monitor all the social networks and specialized websites and any possible web resources to see the information about people disappearing during occupation, and we add all that information to our database. We question those people. Obviously not all of them want to communicate, or not all of them have enough information to make it a comprehensive evidence, or they may just refuse to talk. So we documented 1,000 cases of civilians being kidnapped and kept hostages. I'm responsible for the south of our country, and there we have 347 civil hostages taken in Kherson region. This is what we have documented. If we check the map, we see that the Dnipro River cuts the Kherson region into two parts, and the majority of the hostages, they still remain on the left bank, which is not yet deoccupied. When the right bank was deoccupied, we all know that in the city of Kherson and in the villages and towns around it, in the suburbs, the law enforcement agencies identified a large number of the torture rooms. I will just ask our technical team to zoom into the Kherson region. Yes, those were the torture sites established in some administrative facilities to keep the prisoners in the atrocious conditions which are not envisaged for detention of people, with the lack of potable water, absence of fresh food, or sometimes any food at all. Sometimes they were not able to wash themselves. There were no hygienic paraphernalia, and we know that before the withdrawal from the right bank of Kherson region, a large number of civil hostages were relocated by the Russian military to the left bank. Also, there are people among the civil hostages whose further destiny is unknown. The exhumation is going on, and just a couple of days ago we found a body of a civilian. He was a denizen of Velika Alexandrivka. We were trying to find people, we were trying to find some information about him. His body was found in a river, heavily damaged. So people from the right bank were relocated. Part of them were let go before the occupation. Part of them were relocated to the left bank. On the left bank there is a number of torture sites. Usually they are the the facilities of the police department. So let's zoom out a little bit so we see the whole region. So those are the occupied facilities of the police departments, the cellars, some recreation bases. We know that the Arbatska Spit was occupied. It's the place where there is a large concentration of hotels, touristic facilities, recreation bases. It's a little bit away from the areas of population concentration. So there was one recreation base which was re-equipped as the torture site, and in every wooden building there is from 4 to 10 people being detained, and there are up to 20 such buildings. And there are torture chambers in the hotels near Skadovsk Delphinarium. There is an industrial facility where people are being kept. So part of those people who were relocated from the right bank to the left bank of Kherson region, they are still being kept in the left bank in those torture chambers. A part of the people during the occupation of Kherson region, and even after the occupation, even now, they were located to Crimea. There are the confinement cells, confinement cell 1 and confinement cell 2, so there are people detained over there as well. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, they were just recently built. Well, it existed before, it was just repaired recently. Well, so first this confinement cell 1 was filled with the civil hostages, and the conditions there were very difficult. People were not even let out to take a walk. They are being fed very well. Many people were not able to seek any medical attention, any medical aid. The vast majority, they don't have lawyers. Russian Federation does not confirm the imprisonment, the fact of imprisonment of those people and their locations. So here we may talk about the mayor of Hola Pristan, Oleksandr Babich, who spent more than 1 year already. First he was in confinement cell 1, then he was relocated to confinement cell 2, and Mariano Garcia Cayut, he's the Spanish volunteer who was relocated to confinement cell 1 and then confinement cell 2 from Kherson. Dmitro Zakharov, an entrepreneur from Genishevsk, he spent almost a year over there. Recently, if we may say so, Russian Federation started confirming the fact of detention of certain people. We know that we identified 70 Ukrainians being detained in confinement cell 2, and our colleagues before the New Year, they were saying the number 110 Ukrainians, but the confinement cell 2 has a capacity for more people, so the people from the left bank of Kherson region may be transferred there. People are still being transported further on to Russian Federation. I will give you an example further on. As to the confinement cell 2, where the Ukrainians were transported to from confinement cell 1, they are all located in the city of Simferopol. In confinement cell 2, the conditions are a little bit better. It's painted. There is the video surveillance in every chamber and every cell, and the guards, they watch the prisoners quite diligently. It's prohibited even to practice any physical training there. The meals are better there than in confinement cell 1, and sometimes the prisoners may seek medical help there, and there are dozens or maybe hundreds of people staying there whose presence there is still unconfirmed, and sometimes we only rely to the evidences provided by the relatives. I will tell you maybe later about those people who were identified to be staying there. So who manages to go out of there? Apart from those who were relocated from the right or left bank of Kherson region, a lot of people during evacuation We know that the last months it was difficult to evacuate from Kherson region, and it was only possible through Crimea, because the front line is going along the Dnipro river. The Antonivsky bridge is destroyed, and Zaporizhia passage is closed for evacuation now. So all the people from the left bank of Kherson region, they can only evacuate through Crimea. In order to do this, you have to undergo very meticulous screening measures, which include interrogation check of the telephone, restoration of all the data on the telephone since its acquisition, and many people just don't pass those checks because they may have been subscribed to the patriotic groups in Telegram. They may communicate with their relatives whom they tell what they went through during occupation. So those people are being forwarded to the FSB department, where they are being kept in a cellar, where they await for the polygraph check, and then they are being transferred to confinement cell 1 or confinement cell 2. First it was only number 1, and now it's number 2. So those people are being checked, they are being taken medical tests. A lot of information is collected regarding their families, their opinions on the disputable, the matters which are disputable in the opinion of Russians. So those are the people who may tell just a little bit about their conditions and what and whom they've seen over there in confinement cells. As to the transportation of people who were imprisoned in Kherson region and Mykolaiv region as well, we keep sometimes forgetting about Mykolaiv region. Part of it is still occupied. It's Kinbrun Spit, for example. From there we know a case of kidnapping of at least 2 persons. We know about more cases, but we're talking about only 2. This is whom we got permission from the relatives to talk about. Sergei Leibak, who was kept in confinement cell in Crimea, then he was relocated to Rostov region, and then to Ryazhsk in Ryazan region. So he is being kept with the prisoners of war. The conditions there are very bad. They are real horrific for what we know. Pavlo Zaporozhets, he is attempted to be convicted in the Rostovsky region. He was relocated from Crimea to there, and this is where he is being convicted. So this is the situation that we have there. Please, Miss Kateryna, how the families may work with this map? How can it help them? The map may allow them to understand the location of their close ones, for example, where they were transported. A lot of our relatives who are part of our civil organization, the civilians in captivity, they don't know where their relatives end up at. For example, people may have been walking along the street and then grabbed by the Russians and kept hostages until now. Now, thanks to the fact that the exchanges are being underway, they're going on more frequently, we may find out during questioning of those who were exchanged whether they've seen these or those people being imprisoned. Sometimes people may have not be aware of something within the last 9 months, and then somebody just comes back and they say, I was sitting with him in a cell, or we were relocated together, we were transported. For example, with the civilians, the situation is difficult because they are being transported from one place to another more frequently. Some families, they know that their relatives end up in Kursk region, then to Rostov region, and then back to Kursk, and then again to Kamlech-Shakhtinsky, to Rostov region. Sometimes the people are so desperate that they ask even the Russian lawyers. I can tell you, judging by my experience, My fiancé is still imprisoned, and only after 1 year we were able to find out that he has the official status of prisoner. For 1 year we were not understanding what should we expect for, and there is a lot of families like this. For example, Chernihiv region was under occupation for a month during all March long, and many people still don't know where their relatives are or their friends are. They may have been going from one village to another for some food, and they just disappeared. During the occupation, many relatives were asking the Russians themselves with the questions, where are our relatives, have you seen him? And some of them got some answers like, yeah, he's being dealt with by FSB. Unfortunately, those whom FSB was dealing with, they were found tortured to death. And in Kharkiv region, the situation is the same difficult. There are many people who disappeared and still nothing is known about them. After we established this organization, Civilian in Captivity, we started representing the interests of more than 300 families. Our lists include, from our civil organization, or very little number of civilians came back, but people started finding out who is where. And we communicate with different civil organizations, with Media Initiative for Human Rights. We communicate with the Office of the Commissioner. There is a dialogue, we keep working, but the situation with the civilians is more complicated than with the military. There are agreements, the military, they keep coming back, but the civilians not so much. We only have to wait until they're being let go, so their status is not quite clear. Yes, they are being told they are detained for countering the special military operation. However, there is no such article in the criminal code, and those who come back, based on their experience, they say no matter whether they are civilians or military, they say that they were asked questions: how long are you going to keep us here in detention, and what are the reasons that, based on which you've taken us? And they say if you're lucky enough, you will be let go after 1 month, and if not so lucky, it will take you more than 1 year. As we see, the civilians are being kept in captivity more than 1 year, and no one is going to bring them back. Miss Alla, based on your personal experience, how and in what way can we help? Well, I don't know. The civilians are not being exchanged. As my husband said, for Russia, it doesn't make any difference whether you're a civilian or military. All of them are prisoners of war. For them, it doesn't make any difference at all. This 1648 Security Service of Ukraine, I addressed to all of them. It was just accidentally that he was a civilian being captured, and there was another civilian from Kharkiv region captured with him. He was about 60 years old, and on the 14th of January they were relocated to different cells, and we don't know about what happened to him next. Do we have any questions on the floor, please? Good afternoon, Tetyana Katrychenko, Ukrinform. I have a couple of questions to the speakers. My first question is, how is your dialogue going on with the international organizations? Some people from abroad that you mentioned, they end up in confinement cells in Russia. Is there any communication, any coordination? Is there any plan to liberate them? What are the measures being taken? Well, our coalition, Ukraine 5 AM, and our organization specifically, we are in communication with our international partners all the time. We communicate with the representatives of International Criminal Court and representatives of the United Nations Mission for Human Rights, and representatives of the International Committee of Red Cross, and we understand all the complications, all the challenges that exist in communication with those organizations. We know that there are international organizations that we cooperate with, the human rights organizations whose activities are focused on Ukraine. So that there is the general overall interest to Ukraine, and everybody sees what's going on in Ukraine as a great number of, immense number of international war crimes, and there is a desire to bring the guilty ones to liability on many levels. It's a very complex question, you know. I don't know what to focus on. Well, maybe we focus on efficiency of work of those organizations, whether they can really help, and if so, what can they help with? Well, every organizations, they have their mission and their mandate. The most attention is being paid for the time being to the servicemen who were captured prisoners of war, and sometimes, if we talk about civilians, there is more attention to the International Committee of Red Cross. This organization has a mandate to monitor the places of detention of the military who were captured prisoners of war, and since the beginning of the conflict, they should have kept all the detained persons accounted. I mean, those who were captured prisoners of war, the servicemen, first of all. I'm not mentioning this specific term, but this is the specific nature of the conflict of the conflict in Ukraine. The mandate of ICRC, it only covers the servicemen, but Ms. Alla and many others, they mentioned that Russian Federation, they consider both military and civilians, they see them as combatants, so there is some room for maneuver, you know, to get ICRC engaged in work with the civilians. As to the efficiency, the most interesting and was most demonstrative is that you see on this map in Russian Federation there is a couple of dozens places of detention, starting from the regions along the border where the military and civilians were located first. Everybody was thinking it would be for a month or two. For example, from Kiev region, the civilians were brought to Bryansk region. In Novozybki village, confinement cell number 2. First of all, it was Belgorod region, Kursk region, and then Rostov region, Taganrog in Rostov region, and the city of Rostov itself. There are confinement cells where both military and civilians were kept in, and then when the number of those prisoners started growing, the exchanges are not as intense to compensate for the number of those detained. For example, in Mariupol alone, about 1,500 Marines were detained, and then 2,500 more defenders of Azovstal, so it makes 4,000 in total, let alone other regions. I can't tell about other regions, but those are the figures that demonstrate the scale. So they were transported into the depth of Russian Federation, Tula region, Volgograd region, Ryazan region, Irkutsk region, where the regions most remote from Ukraine, where both civilians and military are being kept in detention. So the ICRC, there is also a large number of places of detention in occupied territories. Even if we admit that the ICRC taking care of their employees, they think that there is active warfare going on in occupied territories. However, that's a very surprising excuse. They cannot guarantee security for the people affiliated with it, so there are no threats for them in Russian Federation, and they can visit those places of detention. Is the matter of access. How active are the representatives of ICRC in requesting that access? How perseverant are they? They keep saying they are a neutral organization which tries to act within some field. They don't want to jeopardize the situation, but at the same time, the people who are kept in those places of detention in the depth of Russian Federation, in some very deep prayer, they keep suffering from how they are being treated by Russian Federation. We cannot say that all the institutions are the same, but the overall picture is horrific. The terrible conditions, even the stationary places of detention, when we were talking about the cellars or some recreation bases. So we can make a parallel with isolation in Donetsk, which was built from scratch. Russia keeps organizing those sites from scratch. I mean, the police departments, the cellars, all of them. But it's not that they were terrible. They were just unfit for keeping people. There was no light. You could not use bathroom there. You could not even drink any water there. But now that we're talking about the places of detention in Russian Federation, though the stationary places, for example, the confinement cell in Donetsk, confinement cell in Bryansk, it's built to have people detained in there, so the conditions are unfit for living. So let's get back to international organizations. Yes, so those places are unfit for living, but it's being added up by constant interrogations, by torturing, by humiliations, by humiliation of human dignity. We're not even talking about the military. So if the International Committee of Red Cross could be more active, they could visit those places of detention, and such preventive visits to such places, they could prevent Russian Federation, the specific citizens and representatives of Russian Federation, not to act in the way they do. But Russian Federation, they don't have. So your answer is they did not visit any such places. No, we cannot say so. They visited such places, but such visits were not effective, not efficient. Our civil organization was present with the new at the meeting with the new president of ICRC, and we were the only representatives for civilians, and everybody was representing the interests of the military. So we asked the question whether their team has ever seen the cells where the civilians are being detained, and we were answered that the Russian Federation doesn't allow the representatives of ICRC to all the cells. They are being brought to some floor of some specific confinement cell, but the ICRC representatives, they cannot pick the cells where they want to go. They are only being brought to the cells where people are in normal conditions, where they recuperated after torturings already. And when we were asking whether they've seen any civilians, they said we've only seen them in the cells where they are being kept together with the military, and they said that if we exercise more pressure on Russia, Russia will stop allowing us. Well, in Ukraine, the ICRC have access to all the places where the Russians are being detained. Well, why I asked this question? I wanted to ask for more details. Look, we have a lot of places of detention in Ukraine. If those territories are deoccupied, the question is what will happen not only to the Ukrainian prisoners of war, but the civilians as well. So during these deoccupations, may the international organizations help save those prisoners on one hand in the territory of Ukraine, and on the other hand those who are being kept somewhere in the depth of Russia. Because what will happen to those people who end up in detention somewhere in Russia. So again, I will expand we understand what is the difference between detention of military and civilians. And another question is what may help solve this problem, because the civilians are just a separate section of this work. Who may help return the civilians, specifically the civilians from Russia? Well, as to the civilians, we understand, on the example of the left bank of Kherson region, the torture chambers that were located closer to the front lines after the occupation of the right bank, they moved deeper. So people were kept in Novakhovka, and now they're relocated to Changar or Kalanchak. So it's closer to Crimea. It's still Kherson region, but closer to the border with Crimea. Some were relocated to the confinement cells, then to Rostov and further on. So it's probable that before the offensive, unless it's a one-day overwhelming operation, just 1 day before the offensive, the prisoners of war will be pulled. Russia will pull them with them. Maybe it will be happening just how it was happening in Kherson. Maybe they will let somebody go, but the logic behind it is incomprehensible. Someone is being kept, someone is being let go. They continue bringing people to Rostov until this day. They probably understand that those people need to be relocated. Maybe they already have such a big number of people that they need to free up some space. As to who could help, we think that probably a third country could be of help in solving the issue of accessibility of the Red Cross, in checking the conditions where the prisoners are being kept in. Well, look, probably you may describe what is going on. The people have some indefinite legal status. How the Russia sees them? They detain them based on what? There should be a procedure. If there is no procedure, it means that it's a crime that should be classified somehow, and it should entail some legal consequences. If there are some legal consequences, there is a legal, well, there should be a question. If there is a crime, for example, they keep account of the prisoners of war, they exchange them, and maybe there will be a temptation to conceal that crime in future. So who can make sure that this crime is not concealed? How can we catch up with Russia in this way? How do we classify it if it is a crime? So what kind of crime it is, and what should we do to make sure the Russians don't have this temptation to conceal those crimes? Well, the Russians already tried to hide their crimes, and we keep talking with our colleagues that in case, well, or when the Ukrainian victory will come, we have no doubt about it. We have no doubt that Russia will return everybody to Ukraine right away, and it will be a problematic issue that should be solved. And to understand whom Ukraine should return, we need to have verified lists of people who are being kept by Russian Federation. We need to have track of the places of detention, because people are being transported. For example, someone is being kept in Novozhivkov for 10 or 12 months, but most of the people are being moved. So it's a very diligent study. It's a very diligent research work to demand to return those people. It's clear that Russian Federation, if we talk about the civil hostages during the armed conflict, the detention of the servicemen is not a war crime. It's normal. The exchanges are going on in compliance with the Geneva Convention. The injured ones are being returned, the wounded ones, those combatants who cannot be engaged in warfare anymore. It's clear, it's understandable, even when they don't give everybody back to us, even those whom Ukraine demands to return. It's clear. But in case of the civil hostages, the detention and the relocation of the civil hostages is a war crime. The Russian Federation commits war crimes for which they should be brought to liability. So what are the legal consequences? Can we expect any appeals to international organizations? May we wait for some resolution by the International Criminal Court, as it happened in case of deportation of children? Well, the ICC, they take into account some specific episodes. We understand that there was attack on the energy infrastructure that ICC is now studying. We want the ICC to get interested in this episode of deportation of civilians, at least from the northern regions of Ukraine, to demonstrate that it was a planned action, it was a planned operation. We understand that in Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy region, different units were stationed that had no communication between them. They were acting autonomously, they were acting very promptly, and all those people, they wanted to detain civilians. They wanted to take civil hostages, in their majority the men, not because they could be fire correctors. Everybody could be fire correctors because many of us, we have friends among the military or special services. We were all communicating among each other, and people were detained just randomly. But it was a planned practice for deportation of civil hostages on the same level with the military, to replenish, well, most likely to replenish the exchange fund. They did not understand where Ukraine will capture their servicemen as prisoners of war. They were not interested whether Ukraine detains any civil hostages. They were calling all the civilians combatants. So it's probably a part of protocol that they wanted to impose, the occupational protocol. They were going to deploy some screening camps here. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Now that we don't have any, please. Michael, sure. Newsweek journal, I'm sorry if I missed this moment, but what is the number of people currently being kept in detention? You mentioned all of them are civil hostages, but whom they were before the war? Were they some, I don't know, teachers who refused to teach under the new Russian program, education program? Well, just in brief, according to the data from the Ministry of Reintegration, who keep track, who have the National Information Bureau as part of their organization, as of the end of February, it's about 950 persons. We are being aided by the Civilians in Captivity civil organization. It's the same number of people. To what extent this information is mentioned, we cannot say. We also don't know about the specific numbers of the civilians because we just cannot disclose those numbers. But the question was about the civil hostages. Well, it's very complicated, you know, to segregate the military from the civils because they are all stationed at the same places in Novozybkov, in Arabaska Street. So were those civilians? The trend was such that in the northern regions, the people were grabbed just randomly. If they were looking suspicious, some were in the checkposts, in the yards. Our colleague, a journalist, Dmitro Haluk, was captured in the yard of his own house, and now he is in confinement cell in Novozybkov just for no reason. So he was exercising his journalist activities. He was publishing news in the page of Union Information Agency, but he was detained as a civil hostage just under suspicion that he helps some special services, and there were people who just walked out in their yard, in their back porch, and in Sumy region, in Trostianets. There are cases that we found out about. The two men just came back home to grab some things from home, and they were detained. The occupation was going on for 1 month in northern region. They did not have enough time to orient well. They just were grabbing the people on a random basis, and in Donetsk and Luhansk region the occupation was going on for years, and those were the practices they spread from those regions. They already had mechanism in place. They were looking for former servicemen, for some bloggers, for just people who could have helped Ukrainian army. So those kinds of people. And the occupation of Kherson region that was going on for a while, they were grabbing people just for living in front of Chernobyevka airfield. People were living just in that house. Well, we know that there was a number of explosions organized by Ukrainian army in Chernobyevka airfield. So the people just were falling under suspicion randomly. The Russians were coming to their houses for inspection, and the people were just detained randomly. For example, blogger Irina Goробtsova, she is currently in Crimea, but she was living near Chernobyevka airport. Also, there are teachers. The teachers who were detained for having their for teaching the protection of their homeland as a subject, and their, for example, the students were in the ranks of the armed forces. They were so such teachers were detained, and there were medics who refused or to provide any medical aid to the Russians. They were detained too, or they were providing medical help, but the Russians say that that was improper medical help. This is why people were detained. So there is no system. Well, there is a system. There is a system of purposeful detention and the random detention. So this is the system they have. So, for example, upon some events like in Chernobyevka, or for example, what's going on in Melitopol now, the people are being detained after some explosion or something, but it's not different from the practice that was in Donetsk or Luhansk region. There was an explosion of the railway, and there was a number of civilians who were suspected to blow up that railway. They were all detained. We don't know whether they were engaged or they were affiliated with those explosions, but there was an explosion and people were detained. Okay, this is how we're going to wrap up. We hope everybody gets back from detention alive and healthy, and we continue our work tomorrow. See you shortly.